If these systems are programmed to find individuals, maybe based on a photo or a video, or even something such as racial, ethnic, gender characteristics, something where that's a physical determining marker, and that's pretty scary.
Welcome to Global Dispatches, a podcast for the foreign policy and global development communities and anyone who wants a deeper understanding of what is driving events in the world today. I'm your host, Mark Leon Goldberg. I am a veteran international affairs journalist and the editor of UN Dispatch. Enjoy the show. I've been hanging around the United Nations these last few days, attending events related to consultations on lethal autonomous weapons systems, so-called killer robots. These are AI-powered weapons systems that can select and strike targets without human control. Now, this is not the stuff of science fiction. These weapon systems exist in the world today, and they are getting more powerful and, frankly, more accessible. They can be relatively inexpensive and deployed by states and non-state actors alike. Today, there are no meaningful regulations pertaining to the use or development of these lethal autonomous weapons systems. There is, simply put, a gap in our global governance of these systems. Here at the United Nations, delegates have been discussing ways to close that gap, potentially through a new legally binding international treaty to regulate or potentially ban some of these systems. My guest today, Anna Hahir, is at the forefront of this effort. She is head of military AI at the Future of Life Institute. In our conversation, Anna Hahir explains what exactly these weapons entail, where and how they are being used today, and what the future holds should these systems be developed without rules or regulations. We then discuss the process of getting a potential treaty on lethal autonomous weapons systems and why, even if key players do not join a treaty, it would still make a difference. This is a topic that I intend to cover frequently on this podcast and on the globaldispatches.org newsletter because, frankly, it is a story very much in my wheelhouse. It is a story about UN process. And as regular listeners know, I just geek out on UN process because UN process really does matter. And now you're combining a story about UN process with a story about potential existential risk and catastrophic risk. And to me, this is just a crucial story that, frankly, I'm uniquely capable of telling, having covered issues like this for so long. So I'm excited to continue to bring episodes to you about this process of potentially getting a legally binding international treaty on lethal autonomous weapons systems. And our conversation today provides great background and context for this issue as it evolves over the months and years to come. So here is my conversation with Anna Hahir of the Future of Life Institute, and we recorded it live via Substack. So, Anna, we are speaking in New York following 2 days of discussions at the United Nations around the idea of regulating in one way or another lethal autonomous weapons systems, so-called killer robots. I want to spend the bulk of our conversation today discussing the process and the need and the necessity of a potentially legally binding international agreement, a treaty on lethal autonomous weapons systems, why it's important. But before we get there, I would love to have you just introduce the idea, the concept of lethal autonomous weapons systems. What are they, and are they being used at all in the world today?
To start off, they exist and they are being used because that's myth number one. We hear that they're science fiction and they're not in use yet, but can confirm they exist and they are in use. But what are they? They are weapons that select, target, and engage without human intervention. And they do this autonomously. And we're seeing that they do it with artificial intelligence, with algorithms. So they're using facial recognition as the way to sense and to target. There are other ways you can use AI in military. We've seen decision support systems. You can use AI for logistics, for planning, but this is really, really specific about some people call it the kill chain. It's about targeting. It can be targeting a person, targeting a tank. It's using an algorithm or artificial intelligence to make the decision to kill, and a human is not involved. That is an autonomous weapon.
So essentially, like the definition is that it makes these decisions without meaningful human control over it. It can select a target and, execute someone based on its own algorithm without a human being ultimately making that decision. Where in the world are these platforms or these systems being used today?
Well, the first instance of use that we saw was believed to be in Libya in 2020, using what was called the cargo loitering munition. This was investigated by the UN, and this is sort of considered to be the first alleged use of autonomous weapons. We are investigating and monitoring where they're used around the world after that. And it would come as no surprise that we're seeing high levels of autonomy used in Ukraine by both the Ukrainian forces and the Russian forces. It's harder to verify on the ground in Gaza, but I think there are high possibilities that autonomous weapons are being used there just because the Israeli Defense Forces have the capabilities and have been developing and amassing them for a while. And we're also seeing sparks of use and news and alleged cases in West Africa. Last year, there was supposed use in Mali. These are by non state actors, so a different kind of armed conflict. So, yeah, the examples I've given are definitely centered around armed conflict, but we're expecting, without regulation and without further work on this issue, we're going to start seeing these weapons outside of armed conflict, maybe used by police forces, border control, and also individuals in our everyday lives.
So, as you describe it, the technology is being used, not being used on any massive scale yet. At least it seems to be somewhat like incipient. Where, from like a technological perspective, look, where are and how are these weapons developing? Like, what is the future of autonomous weapons if there are no regulations curtailing its use in warfare?
Well, this to me is one of the scary parts, is in that they are not necessarily advanced, boutique, inaccessible systems that only a handful of states or actors can use. Those definitely do exist. You can have autonomy in submarines and things like that. You can add autonomy in all sorts of weapons, but the use cases that are being are sort of the middle category of military off the shelf, commercially bought. And they're not that expensive depending on if you're a state or an organized group. You can buy a system between 2 to 5,000 US dollars. And then there's the other category, and I find this one particularly scary, is like crude homemade autonomous weapons. You can buy a paintball gun or a hobby drone, so all sort of civil objects, and then you can give it an engaging or killing capability. You can add a gun to it, and you basically use the facial recognition technology that we have with our phones. You just have an optical sensor camera, and it's the same technology. What we call target lock is the same technology that you use with your face to unlock your phone. So, in terms of proliferation, that's one of the big things that we talk about with this issue. The risk is high, particularly for the homemade crude types and the off the shelf bought commercially available types.
And, I've also seen discussed here over the last couple of days around the UN. One of the real dangers is, down the road, maybe not this year or next, or maybe even this year or next, depending on the pace of the technological development, which I don't really have a good handle on, that you could have instances in which these relatively cheap, as you said, systems could be deployed at scale. You could have so-called swarms of drones working in concert with each other, and they could autonomously be determined to select a target. That target could be an individual, it could be an entire city. And this is where autonomous weapons, kind of, at least in my view, seem to cross that threshold into potential weapons of mass destruction. Could you maybe like flesh out that scenario?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, there's this swarming capability. So that means using usually UAVs, so drones or flying autonomous weapons, in the scale of between tens to 50 to 100 to thousands. There's no sort of definition of swarm, but you can just imagine it's a lot. And they can be programmed to work together. The official term is called multi-agent capabilities. And the way that weapons manufacturers are selling this idea of swarming is that you can have mass on the battlefield without a lot of human involvement, human operators. And we're seeing that the most highly skilled human operator that controls, normal drones, for example, they can only really control between 7 to 11 at a time. But the way these weapons are being sold are that you're not going to have, hundreds to thousands of human operators controlling your swarm. That's not the idea. So you don't have, as you said, meaningful human control over a swarm. And going to the weapons of mass destruction idea, if these systems are programmed to find individuals, maybe based on a photo or a video, or even something such as racial, ethnic, gender characteristics, something where that's a physical determining marker, then that's pretty scary because, a lot of states talk about this issue as if they're the only ones that are going to have these. But if you've got all sorts of actors, non-state actors, whoever, using this swarm mode, there's the potential for mass killings, for genocide. And I do want to touch on this point of precision and distinguishing, because this is very relevant to swarms and mass killings. Weapons manufacturers at the moment claim that these systems are really precise. They're playing into the whole argument of, can these weapons follow the Geneva Conventions? Can they do distinction and proportionality? And so the weapons manufacturers are hearing that, and they're saying, yes, our weapons are precise. They can tell the difference between a child, a combatant, a different type of tank compared to another tank. First of all, that's not the case. That's not what we're seeing on the ground. They're not that precise. They even have difficulty autonomously navigating, as in, if the surface you're navigating is uniform or homogeneous, meaning it looks the same, such as sand, snow, one color, they can't operate. And that capability is not so advanced as targeting or recognition. So they're not that great. But in a world, let's say technological advancement happens and these weapons can distinguish between these types of people. In the hands of certain actors, that means you can carry out genocide. Because if they're that precise, they can distinguish between different people. So it's a lose-lose situation, depending on if they're not so capable or if they get really capable, as weapons developers say they.
And a point that I want to emphasize, that was emphasized to me by the foreign minister of Sierra Leone, who I interviewed yesterday, is that, and something you've mentioned just now, is that these weapon systems, as they developed, are relatively accessible. These are not something that are just in the ability of states to possess and to wield. And for him, as someone who cares deeply about peace and security in West Africa, you have a proliferation of terrorist groups out there who could very easily access these weapons and deploy them to devastating effect. And so, for him at least, that is why there ought to be some sort of international regulation, rules of the road on whether or not to develop these, how to develop them, whether or not to put export controls on them, which I take it there really aren't at the moment. So that brings us to this process at the United Nations. You've, I think, articulated the problem, the challenge that these weapon systems pose to international peace and security. Over the last couple of days at the UN, there have been some talks on, what to do about them. So can you catch listeners up to speed on what has been the process of trying to establish some rules around using these weapon systems, developing these weapon systems, and ultimately whether or not some of them ought to be banned altogether?
So this issue has been discussed at the UN for almost 10 years now, and it's been discussed in Geneva at the Convention for Certain Conventional Weapons, and I'll call that the CCW now.
Mm-hmm.
So these are Geneva diplomats. They're working level diplomats in Geneva. They're disarmament experts, and they've been talking about, they call them lethal autonomous weapons. And I'll give it credit. It's been an excellent technical forum for them to work out what are the main issues, what are the convergences, what are the divergences. And after this number of years, they've settled basically on a draft treaty text. They call it the rolling text. That's what it's called this year. But from where I sit and where a lot of civil society sits and people that are watching this debate, it looks like a very good set of elements for a treaty to start being negotiated. So a lot of work has been done and we're ready to go. However, the forum of the CCW isn't politically credible in terms of turning things into actual tangible instruments of law. No new instrument of law from that body has come there for over 20 years. And that's because there's a consensus voting system where every state gets to veto anything that's voted upon. And it's not big things like a new instrument. It's sometimes just what are we going to talk about next year and for how many days.
Any state could kind of gum up the works if they wanted to by blocking consensus at the Commission on Certain Conventional Weapons, the CCW.
A lot of work gets done, and then right at the end, usually at the last day, one or a few states will just block the work. And there are states in the world that don't want to see any new rules. So we know for sure that in this political climate, we're not going to get a treaty from the CCW. So there's been attempts by states to take the issue out of the CCW, and that's a very sensitive diplomatic process. But things are looking good, and I say that because we have 129 states who support a legally binding instrument. The treaty is based on a two-tier approach. That's what the treaty looks like. So it's not a traditional ban treaty in the way that we see with landmines, cluster munitions, other conventions. It has a set of prohibitions and a set of regulations. So there'll be some systems that are prohibited, the most egregious and morally repugnant, as the UN Secretary General calls them. Those would be unpredictable. And we're pushing for systems as well that are anti-personnel, so systems that specifically target people, that they should be banned. And basically, you can only use autonomous weapons if they meet a certain threshold or criteria. That's what the treaty says. Why we've been here in New York this week, and why you've been here, is a diplomatic process to find a new venue, a new way to talk about this issue. An important place to do this because it allows all UN member states to have a voice and to participate. Not every country is a party to the CCW. Many countries who are not party are going to face those effects of autonomous weapons.
So at the CCW, because it's a consensus-based process, even though there have been substantively some good progress, as you describe it, there are like elements of a decent treaty that have been negotiated at the CCW, it's not actually able to be effectuated because certain countries are blocking that consensus. Can you just maybe walk me through, what countries are the ones thus far in the international system, specifically now at the CCW, that are most hostile to regulating autonomous weapons systems? And like, what are their arguments and interests in blocking it?
Yeah, well, I guess it comes as no surprise it's the countries that are developing and using them or wanting to use them. A big player is Russia. I'd say they are the most openly explicit in terms of their position that they don't want any rules. Like that's on the most extreme end, that they say current international law is enough. The Geneva Convention's enough. We don't need any new rules on autonomous weapons. And so there's a spectrum of, the naysayers, I call them. We also have the US, Iran, China, South Korea, Israel, and India, to name some. But those countries, there are nuances in their positions. They actively participate in the work. They actively participated in getting the elements to where they are for the draft treaty, but they want rules to be soft. They don't want them to be legally binding. They want them to be guidelines and principles or like national rules that are soft. They don't want the legal nature that allows the laws to have teeth, to actually use them to hold states accountable. So they're very active in participating, and they often have great contributions. But when it comes right down to the end, the last day, they don't want this to be in a treaty.
And so thus the challenge of continuing negotiations at the CCW. You have that consensus process where any country, as I said, can kind of gum up the works, and you have countries adamantly opposed to a legally binding instrument of one way or another. So civil society groups like yours, like many others, there's a whole campaign called Stop Killer Robots, which is a coalition of a number of advocacy organizations like Human Rights Watch and Amnesty, have put pressure on states to try to switch venues to the UN General Assembly itself, where in the treaty process, there is no sort of consensus-based formula where countries can object, but they could just be outvoted. And so that brings us to the consultations that have been ongoing at the United Nations over the last couple of days. What have you been seeing or hearing that will suggest to you whether or not there is indeed momentum building towards, formally moving this process to the General Assembly where potentially a legally binding treaty could be negotiated?
Well, even before this week, over the past 2 years, we've seen all the regional blocs come together. So first we saw Latin America and the Caribbean come together in a regional conference and produce a regional position saying they want a treaty. Then we saw this for West Africa. Then we saw this specifically for the Caribbean. Then we saw the Philippines host a conference in Asia Pacific, bringing that group together. And then Austria hosted the first international conference at 144 states. So it also felt a bit like the UN, and they talked about the call for a treaty. When you talk about momentum, that is huge momentum. That's sort of what we've seen in history before we get treaties and conventions, is this sort of block by block approach from the world where all the big regions come together. So this week in New York, we saw countries who are not party to the CCW participate on this issue with their own expertise, their own country or regional voice and investment. And that's huge. To the outside world, that might not seem big, but when you're on the path to a treaty, that's really big. I mean, everyone wants universal adhesion. You want the whole world to come up, but you've got to go country by country and region by region. So we're seeing countries come to the table, some of them for the first time realizing this issue applies to them and they realize the terror of this issue and they also realize that they have a say. Others who've wanted to have a voice on this issue, they've seen the CCW, they're not party to it, but now they get to have a voice. And the thing that brings me hope is that these talks this week in New York, for the first time, allowed states to talk about the issue in its entirety. In Geneva, in the CCW, that forum only allows us to talk about it through international humanitarian law, the Geneva Convention. It's only a sliver of the way we can talk about this. I touched upon some security risks like proliferation, genocide, but there's ethical risks, there are human rights risks, there are technological concerns. So there's no point sort of just talking about this issue just in a very narrow prism that doesn't really fully capture the whole point. Talking about it in New York or elsewhere allows us the freedom to talk about the issue properly and gives all countries a voice in this matter.
So it's not guaranteed that this process in New York will eventually lead to formal treaty negotiations. But as you described, and as I've sensed here the last couple of days, there really is a momentum towards that end goal. What will it take, therefore, for us to get to where we are now, which is like kind of a hodgepodge of informal negotiations, to an actual process, formal negotiations around a treaty that, may or may not be approved, but actually like have formal negotiations around a treaty talks, as they're called?
There are numerous options and avenues. You can use a General Assembly resolution to kick off negotiations. Before that, you can create what's called an open-ended working group. And that basically is just another group. It's a bit more formal than what we saw this week. We had informal consultations. But an open-ended working group is another way to just create your own forum that can launch negotiations. The venues within New York are the General Assembly and the First Committee, so you can use both of those to launch the process. And there's also the possibility to not do it through the UN, and it's called a state standalone process, where just a state or maybe a group of states decides that they're going to launch negotiations in their own capacity. And we've seen that with conventions such as the Landmines and the Cluster Munitions Conventions. So there are a few ways to do it, and they all require a lot of sensitive diplomacy. But we've started negotiations for other treaties with far less than what we have today ready in our tool belt.
So the reason that I'm sort of focusing so deliberately on process here is that, as someone who's covered the UN for nearly 20 years at this point, one truism that I often articulate to audiences that I've repeated probably ad nauseum on this podcast over the many years is that at the United Nations, more so than any bureaucracy I've ever encountered in my life, process dictates outcomes. And so, you sort of look for the outcome you want, which in your case is a legally binding treaty. And so you find the right UN process that will lead you there. And so that's why I think it's important to flesh out process questions. But beyond process questions, I would love to have you articulate, explain, what would you, as an advocate, as someone who really has been at the fore of convening states around these issues and civil society around these issues, what do you want to see in a treaty? What would be your maximalist outcome from a treaty on lethal autonomous weapons systems?
I want to see a positive obligations approach. So that means all systems are banned unless they can be proved to have meaningful human control. And that means the human operator needs to know why, what, when, and how a system is operating. So where, for how long, what targets. And the human operator needs to be able to stop the operation or the system in use at any point. You can't sort of launch it off and that's it. The system then goes finds a target, because war is chaos, as they say, and your target may suddenly turn into a person that's hors de combat. Things change very fast. So a human operator needs to be able to have meaningful human control at every point. And going back to the prohibitions, I would want to see unpredictable systems, which basically is the opposite of meaningful human control. If you don't have meaningful human control, it's unpredictable. Those are banned. And systems that target humans, anti-personnel systems. If I had to make a big compromise and I had to pick one of those things, I would want a ban on anti-personnel systems. I don't want to see a world where it becomes normal for autonomous weapons to be flying around by all sorts of actors and they kill humans. That's what makes them very accessible. Like, to kill a human is a lot easier than killing a tank, just in terms of ammunition and the tech and the things that you need. I don't want to live in a world where you're afraid of drones flying around and you don't necessarily live in an armed conflict, but you have to fear autonomous weapons in your everyday life. And at the moment, so much atrocity and horror is happening, and it's very normal to become numb to what you're seeing. But we find that when people do face this issue, whether it's just in the abstract, like you describe it, or they might see an image of it, everyone has this gut instinctual reaction of, I do not want autonomous weapons to exist. Like, this shouldn't happen. Our key argument is the ethical reason. Algorithms should not make the decision to kill. They do many other things in our lives and they make lots of errors, but this is sort of the ultimate thing that an algorithm can do in its interaction with a human: kill you and end your life. And for me, profoundly, that is unethical. And then all the other risks sort of come from that. Like, they will destabilize the world. There are profound global security risks. They can cause wars, escalation. They create it very difficult to de-escalate. They can increase the risk of nuclear war happening. And that doesn't necessarily mean autonomous nuclear weapons. We're just talking about one algorithmic error happening in a tinderbox situation or an environment between nuclear powers.
Well, I mean, you're describing, I suppose, a really frightening future and a very far less stable environment than today, should these weapons be deployed and develop at a pace that they are being developed right now. So I guess my question to you is, to what extent are we in a race against time, that the pace and scale of development of these systems might move quicker than our ability to control them through global governance structures and through a treaty at the United Nations?
There are two races happening. There's the arms race, so proliferation, fast technological development, and lots of posturing, states saying that they have them, boasting that they have them. And then there's the race to set existing norms into concrete laws. And if states want to use and normalize these weapons without regulation, then they'll likely face the consequences of this. There's a very narrow window where we're actually able to set laws and norms before they proliferate. And if we look back to history, we did this with other egregious weapons, such as chemical and biological weapons. We heard a lot of the same lines that we're hearing now, such as, we need these weapons against our adversaries. Our adversaries have them. We'd be weaker without them. Also, they're exciting. They give us promises. They give us an advantage or an edge in our military capabilities. We heard that with now banned and regulated weapons. So we've done it before, and during periods of very high tension and hostility. It's just that we're asking humanity to act and prevent something from happening, which we're not very good at doing. We're, states and diplomats to create a treaty before we see an absolute catastrophe, whether it's in an armed conflict or outside just with civilians. So that's the urgency, is that we're trying to prevent something horrible happening. They're already being used. There absolutely already are casualties. It's just very difficult on the ground to verify autonomy. But when we start to see outside of armed conflicts, then it will be very clear to us.
Mhm. One kind of recurring point of devil's advocacy that I've seen being raised over the last couple of days here around the UN is, what's the point of a treaty if the key players in this space, the United States, Russia, Israel, Turkey, Iran, those countries that have the capacity, that have developed these weapon systems, will exist outside that treaty? Like, there's no way that they will sign a treaty, let alone, ratify a treaty restricting their own use of these weapons systems when they have a material advantage here against other geopolitical adversaries. So, like, what's the point?
Well, a treaty, it's also called an instrument. It's a tool that we use. It has a life after it's created. And treaties are tools that everyday citizens can use to hold their countries and governments to account as to why they haven't joined it. We've seen with other treaties where the so-called major players didn't join right away. They either did join afterwards or they were profoundly affected by its existence anyway. It had such a normative power that some major players still abided by the treaty or wanted to be seen doing so, even if they didn't actually sign up.
Mm.
Followed the lead of these countries that don't want a treaty, we're going to have a very profoundly insecure, unsafe world. But I would say the ultimate goal is to have a treaty where everyone joins. The middle road is to have a treaty where you don't have everyone to start with, but you have a very profound normative tool to help. And then the other end is you have nothing. So we take the realist approach that we absolutely need something and we need to start somewhere. And if we had this mindset of we need everyone at the table to start with, we wouldn't have many of the conventions that we have today.
Mm.
So it's not an excuse to let basically the rest of the world, so many regions around the world, suffer at the hands of these weapons and not do it just because a minority, I mean, we are talking about a minority here, want to be able to use them with impunity.
That's interesting. A couple weeks ago interviewed the head of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty Organization on this show, and he made the point that, before, I think it was like 1996 when the treaty was signed, there were something like 2,000 nuclear weapons tests around the world. Since then, there's been maybe like a dozen. And, as you said, like the key players, in this case, the United States is not a part of that treaty, but the United States would not and has not tested a nuclear weapon because the treaty really helped to firm a norm against such a move. And so, as I see you saying it, a treaty on lethal autonomous weapons systems, even if countries existed outside of it, there would be a stigma attached to using it, to deploying these weapon systems in ways that violate the treaty that would prevent their use.
I do want to dispel another myth, or like sort of also like devil's advocate argument we hear, because we're talking about how accessible these weapons are, and people often leave this conversation with a feeling of fear of like, oh, we're screwed if they're so accessible, if someone can make them in their garage. But I say this to myself and not just others because I also have the fear. We all have the power to make chemical weapons in our own houses with very accessible household cleaning products. And we have a convention and we have verification regimes to stop these weapons being used in armed conflict. But verification doesn't stop a weapon being used in an everyday life. But we don't see chemical weapons attacks happen very often outside of armed conflict, or if at all. And yet they're very, very accessible, even more so than, a very crude autonomous weapon. And I would argue that's because of a strong legal norm. It's this invisible thing that's tangible. We can't sense it or feel it, but it still protects us. It's acting now. And so that's the power of a norm. We sense at the moment that international law fails us. It's being disregarded and disrespected, but it's still working at the moment. We just don't record the prevention of death or the prevention of disaster. It just doesn't happen, so we don't realize. But norms and legal norms from treaties and conventions still protect us to this day. So I would like to leave the audience with hope that international law still works. It's just that you don't see it and we don't record it.
Thank you so much for speaking with me today and for sharing your perspective and for your work on this treaty as well.
It's a pleasure.
Thanks for listening to Global Dispatches. The show is produced by me, Mark Leon Goldberg. It is edited and mixed by Levi Sharp. If you are listening on Apple Podcasts, make sure to follow the show and enable automatic downloads to get new episodes as soon as they're released. On Spotify, tap the bell icon to get a notification when we publish new episodes. And of course, please visit globaldispatches.org to get on our free mailing list, get in touch with me, and access our full archive. Thank you.